the Germans were. And on top of one of their concrete fortifications, there was a flag with a great big Nazi swastika on it. I could look right over and see it.
Must have caught your attention.
It sure did. And I showed the director of the battery where I was supposed to go. He said, well, if you go, you'll meet the Germans very quickly. So I can tell you I altered my return route so that I avoided them.
Thank God.
Yes.
There must have been many, many stories that many people, as you went from towns like Cologne and Verdun and Wiesbaden. Those names have so much history with them. You probably remember them, though, in terms of very human encounters in these dangerous places.
Yes. Well, there weren't so many of them. The Germans didn't come up to me often. One time I remember I was driving along with my driver, and I saw a German funerary group on their way to a cemetery, led by their pastor, a Lutheran clergyman, and I thought we ought to show respect for whoever it was that was dead, so I pulled up my Jeep and asked him to get out. We both stood at attention while it passed in front of us. There were not many such instances. When, of course, after the war was over, we were inundated with German people. We had them all around us. They were doing all kinds of things for us. And they were very obedient. There had been alarm that there might be these groups of wolves who would attack us after we came into Germany, a kind of German resistance. There wasn't any of that at all.
What's our time? We have another.
We are 32 minutes into
Okay,
the
so you have another half an hour. I think a little less.
I remember one of your stories that was about a woman who had her baby in her arms.
Oh, yes.
Where was that, and what was that story?
Wiesbaden. We moved into Wiesbaden. General Bradley moved his main headquarters into Wiesbaden towards the end of the war. And on the night of the 2nd of February, 1945, the British came over and bombed Wiesbaden, and in 20 minutes' time, 1/3 of this beautiful old resort town disappeared. 1/3 of it. And there were many dead, of course. And when we got there, I had my chaplain's headquarters in the large department store in Wiesbaden on the 2nd floor. And we had 2 German women cleaning the apartment. The Germans were very eager to get any kind of a job they could with our army. And one of them was this young woman who told about how when the bombing was going on, she had her recently born little baby in her arms, and she was fleeing away to a shelter when a bomb nearby burst, blew the baby out of her arms, and she never saw the baby again. And I thought Armel LaRue, who was an artist working on these shards, when she came across the shards from the old Russian church on the hill above Wiesbaden. She found one shard that looked, like a feminine figure with arms raised, and I thought that was so appropriate to have, because it's as if the little baby was memorialized in a way. Yes.
It must have been very hard to walk through all that devastation, the roofs and ceilings blown out, and the
Yes.
glass broken,
Yes.
and the people broken.
Yes. Yes. Well,
If I could switch our subject just a little bit again,
yes.
you were a pastor for these hundreds and thousands of soldiers that came to the services that you organized. What was it that took you into the ministry, to becoming an Episcopal priest? Could you tell us a little bit about your journey into ministry?
Well, I suppose it was because I fell in love with Anglicanism. And it just seemed such an ideal world to live in a parish church with people similarly inclined. Yes.
Well, it's sort of interesting to put that very gentle country parson picture
Yes.
next to the kind of life you've
And
led,
the
circling the globe.
Every kind of person in it. I remember when we were stationed in Verdun, a little group of 30 of us were sort of specially involved one with another, and one of them was a Jewish doctor. He was so lively, so amusing. He used to greet me and say, "Oh, what a wonderful rabbi you would have been," which I enjoyed. Mm-hmm.
You must have gotten very close to rabbis and priests along the way.
Oh, yes, yes, indeed, yes.
What have you enjoyed most about being a priest and the life that's given you?
Well, it's been a rich life. There's been lots of variety to it, and it's meant that I've had parishes in Portland and Honolulu, and then I've been back in Europe again after the war.
What were you doing there?
Looking after Episcopalians in the military services. Altogether, we had more than 500,000 troops in Europe at that time, so they were scattered everywhere, and I had to travel all over Europe again for about 15 years, and then I went down to...
For 15 years in Europe?
Yes.
Working in parishes from one country to another?
Yes, yes. Not parishes so much as military units. I
see.
Call up the chaplain, and they were chaplains of every kind, and they would, I would tell them that I would be coming on a certain weekend, and they would schedule a time for a service for any Episcopalians to come to who wanted to, and so it...
Sounds like you were a military bishop there, however informally.
Well, I did have responsibility for all the Episcopalian chaplains in Europe. There were usually about 15 of them, and they all had their problems too, so it did involve a good deal of counseling and administrative work. Mm-hmm.
Now, when the war itself ended, did you just pick up and head back to the U.S.? What was must have been a very, very high, exciting time, and then all of a sudden, you're there, and how are you going to get home?
It was as dull as could be. Yeah. We got home from a staging area in the south of France. And the day we arrived in New York, there was a strike on. So these troops that had been waiting for years and months and weeks to get back home, were pretty peeved that the labor forces in New York City were holding us for 1 day longer while we had to sit adrift in the Hudson River before we could get ashore. But we did, and
Must have been a thrilling time
yes,
to come back into the country.
we went to a staging area in New Jersey where they gave us the welcome home dinner on this long passage from Marseille back to New York. At every meal excepting breakfast, for dessert we had peach ice cream. Now, peach ice cream was just wonderful the first time it came, because we never had any ice cream in Europe during the time we were there, and everybody thought it was so great. But you know, after another 10 days of it, it began to get pretty tiresome. And so we were received by a general who told us about this wonderful dinner we were going to have. And then he said, and for dessert you will have. And we shouted out as one group, no peach ice cream. You didn't know what was happening.
Did they serve it?
No, thank goodness, no.
Before we leave Europe, I understand some of the glass came from a residence of Hitler's. Was there a direct connection? What was that about?
Well, I was down at Berchtesgaden. He had his home above the town of Berchtesgaden at a place that is called Obersalzberg. The city of Salzburg in Austria is very close by. And I got there. The first troops who got to Salzburg were French troops, and they traipsed all through the building. The building had been bombed by our Air Force earlier, but much of it was still standing. We later dynamited the building so that it would not be used by the Nazis as kind of a shrine for Adolf Hitler. So when you go to Obersalzberg today, you will see where it was. But when I got there, American troops had displaced the French, and it was quite soon after the end of the war. Quite soon. I can't tell you just exactly when. But we parked my Jeep, and I walked up those steps which had received Chancellor Chamberlain, you know, and the Austrian head of state and so forth, to be berated by Hitler, and walked into the great room where he had received them with its large window overlooking the beautiful German mountains. And there was glass everywhere. And I walked through the room into a corridor that led to some stairs going up to the more private rooms upstairs. And I picked up quite a number of these broken pieces of glass that were deeply smoked by the explosion of the bombs which had shattered the windows. And I put them away and brought them back. And I think Armel has done a very good job of assembling them against a background of blood red glass, sort of illustrating the terrible things that belonged to Hitler and his decisions, and with these gray, smoky glass pieces in the window. I think it should be thought-provoking for anybody who looks at it.
How much more time, Clara?
Quarter.
So 15 minutes. We're trying to keep it to an hour, just if that's okay with you. So.
Some of the other windows, the Thionville window seems very powerful. What happened? What happened there?
Well, Thionville, I believe, was destroyed before the Battle of the Bulge. But at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, I knew the little town. It was just a little wayside French town. And I'd driven past it. Maybe the church had been in ruins before, I don't know. But during the Battle of the Bulge, the most remarkable military feature of it was the way General Patton's army, which had been stationed down at, I won't remember the name of the town. He took his army
Patton did.
And redirected it north. He'd been fighting the Germans to the east, but he redirected it north and shouldered up the southern end of the Bulge. It was regarded as, you see, you can't just press a button and have these things happen. You have thousands of people who are involved, and he managed to get it with great rapidity north. And I was driving back from Luxembourg City, where he was headed, when his armored columns were going north. It was snowing, it was terribly cold, and I could look into the little squints of the tanks where the driver would be, you know. You could just see how cold and hurting they were. And then here was this desolate little town, just in ruins, and I went aside and got some of those shards. It was just typical of what happened in so many places, Metz, Perrier, Coutances, all over this path of tragedy, which was General Bradley's war path, but necessary.
Did you ever connect with General Patton?
Yes, yes.
What was that like?
Oh, that was an experience. It was at Christmas time, and I went up to Luxembourg. He now stationed himself just a little north of Luxembourg, and the people in Luxembourg were half expecting the Germans to come in and take their town again. Indeed, one of our officers saw a woman who'd pulled out a Nazi flag, and she was ironing it in order to hang out in front of her shop or whatever it was. And it was known that many in the town were German sympathizers. And I got there a little ahead of time for the Christmas service, and an aide to General Bradley appeared, General Patton, and said, "Now, General Patton says this is Christmas, and he's an Episcopalian, and so he must go to church." Now, we think it's very unwise for him to go to church. We think somebody in the congregation might rise up and shoot him when he's in church. But he said, General Patton makes his own decisions. So now what service should he come to? And I said he should come to the communion service, which will follow a general service. So he went away, and I held the general service, and the church was just crowded with soldiers. And because there wasn't places for them all to sit, they tended to move around. It was rather noisy. But at the end of the service, when I was ready to give the blessing, a strange silence fell on the church. And I knew it wasn't a sense of awe because I was going to give a blessing, because I looked down the church and there at the back was one lone figure. It was General Patton. His very presence had sort of quieted everybody. So I went back and greeted him and reminded him that in World War I, when the Kaiser was in Luxembourg as the Lord High War Maker for the Germans, he used to come to church here, and I said, "Sir, would you like to take the Kaiser's place?" He smiled and said, "Lead me to it."
So you took him down there?
Yes, I did. Yes, yes.
And then he took communion?
Yes, he did. Yes, yes. Yes, he was very devout.
Did he
In a
seem as
strange
tough as his
way.
reputation?
Oh, yes. We all had to drive our Jeeps with the top down because they thought there might be German aircraft. We had to be watchful. He, however, had a top on his Jeep made of what I would call isinglass, you know, that plastic. So he was a little special.
The window that one of the most touching windows is the one that talks about, or tells the story of your staying overnight in a home where you were, where the son there was a prisoner of war of the Germans.
Yes.
Where was that, and what was that about?
Yeah, no, just a bit of where was that? That was near the great cemetery.
Was that Verviers?
Verviers, yes, Verviers. And Verviers was in pretty good shape. It was our custom to, we had an officer there responsible for quartering any Americans who came through. And he sent me to a family right near a church, a Roman Catholic church, of course. And the head of the house, a woman, took me in for the night and put me in her son's room. And here I was occupying the room that belonged to this young man, this young Belgian. He had just been scooped off the street of Verviers because he was young and put on a German army truck and taken into Germany to work as a slave laborer. So he was gone. Nobody knew then whether he would ever return or not. Seemed so strange to be sleeping in the bed of this young person with all the pictures of his athletic prowess and the books that he liked to read, you know, and his clothes, and you just wondered what had happened to him, as people all over Europe were wondering about what is happening to the slave labor that the Germans had scooped up and taken away.
Where did you hold your worship services? Did you ever go to synagogues or cathedrals, or?
Yes, yes.
I guess some of them were bombed out, so you didn't have an opportunity.
I was often invited by a Jewish chaplain to come and make some comment on one of the psalms at their services.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at the first opening of a Jewish group in Versailles, and again in Verdun.
You mean at a temple?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It was an informal group. No, the Vichy government had ruined most of these synagogues in France. The synagogue in Verdun, we reestablished. And I was responsible, with the help of Jewish officers in one of our units in Verdun, at restoring the Jewish synagogue there. And they made regular use of all the time that we were in the city. And then I was responsible, with their help too, for holding the first Seder service in France after the Hitler incursion in 1940.
That must have been a very moving service.
Well, it was.
Considering that
and
war.
It was a very large one. And a Catholic chaplain and I sat well to the fore in the service. And right in the middle of the service, a big sort of burly fella came in and squeezed in and sat beside me, with the Catholic chaplain on the other side, and identified himself as Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. That was rather surprising.
Must have been a surprise.
Yes.
Synagogue glass?
There's one window.
One of the windows has glass from a synagogue. Could you tell
That's
us?
in Verdun, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I got very little, poor pickings in Verdun. I got one little piece of glass from the cathedral there, and one little piece from the synagogue, and one little piece from the poor little Protestant chapel there, to signify the way we worked together during the war.
It was a real interfaith effort.
Yes, it was that. Yes, it was that.
There was another window that I wanted to ask you about. I just lost it, but I'm...
Because you have 5 minutes, we can do another bit, but just if you want to do any sort of concluding things, because we've gone over all the windows with our mouth.
Well, you have. You
Yeah.
pretty well...
Yeah, so you might want to
seen-
ask something about something else.
I heard tell that you started a seminary there on the battlefield. What was that all about?
Not on the battlefield. Not until the war was over, and we were settled in Wiesbaden. And I started the 12th Army Group School of Theology. We printed up course notices and such, and it was very popular. There was quite a flooding of men to learn more about the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the new movement towards ecumenism. Yes.
Well, it sounds like that was a very ecumenical, interfaith kind of
It was, yes, it was.
Because your students came from just all the soldiers?
Yes. We had a Catholic chaplain teaching and a Baptist chaplain teaching, and myself. That's the way it went. Mm-hmm.
And then what about the university that you helped create in a similar context?
Oh, well, when the war was over, we had several million American troops in Europe, every one of them anxious to get on a ship and go back home. In the information and education section of the Army, they tried to help alleviate the situation a little bit by establishing 4 universities. One of them in England, Scrivener, one of them in Florence in Italy, and one of them in Biarritz in southwestern France. In the month of June, following VE Day on May 8th, it was just a bright idea in some lieutenant's head in Paris. But by August, just 2 months later, these universities had opened, and they were really quite prestigious. The Army had sent invitations to prominent teachers